And so now we'll begin with the closing statement of the plaintiffs. Mr. Wisner, when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Counsel. Hi, everyone. It's been a long trial, and it's been a while since I've spoken to you, about a month. At the beginning of this trial, I told you this case was about choice, and the fact that Monsanto, by not warning, deprived consumers in California and Mr. Johnson of the right to make an informed choice about what chemicals he exposed himself, and in this case, what chemicals he actually exposed to children in the Benicia School District. But as this case has unfolded, it's occurred to me that this isn't just about the choice that was robbed from my client. It's also about the choices that Monsanto made. You see, Monsanto made a choice when it got Dr. Perry's report in 2000 to not share it with the EPA or anyone. They made a choice to not do the studies that Dr. Perry recommended because they knew what it would show. They made a choice to not study the formulated product in long-term carcinogenicity studies. And the best explanation I could hear so far was that because it would have killed all the rats and mice. They made a choice when they didn't call Mr. Johnson back. When he called the company, desperate for answers, asking for some information about the stuff that he was spraying at that time. And when Dr. Goldstein didn't call him back, that continued to deprive him of that choice. Monsanto made a choice to engage in ghostwriting. You've seen document after document where Monsanto's response to scientific concerns, legitimate scientific concerns, is to make up science. Put someone else's name on it and no one's the wiser. We saw that email from Dr. Heidens where he said, that's what we did with Williams in 2000. That's the same article referenced in all the literature. And it's the same article that Monsanto's internal PowerPoint said had served them well for over a decade. It's the same article in the EPA report that's cited repeatedly. Monsanto made a choice to not put a cancer warning on the label. Right now, you've heard testimony that the material safety data sheet discloses the IR classification. Right now, that's the case. But the very label that goes to actual people using it in the field, using it in their job, doesn't say anything. That's a choice. That is a choice that reflects reckless disregard for human health. It is a choice that Monsanto made, and today is their day of reckoning. Every single cancer risk that has been found had this moment. Every single one. Where the science finally caught up. Where they couldn't bury it anymore. Where the truth got shown to 12 people sitting in a jury box making a true and honest decision. And that is this day. This is the day Monsanto was finally held accountable. And this is the beginning of that day. Because after this trial is over, after you return a verdict that says, Monsanto, no more, warn, call people back, do the studies that you needed to do for 30 years, studies that the EPA asked them to do in the 80s. Do your job. And if you return a verdict today that does that, it actually changes the world. I mean, it's crazy to say that, right? I told you all at the beginning of this trial that you were part of history, and you really are. And so let me just say, thank you. I know you guys didn't actually have a choice to be on this jury, and so it's kind of a weird thing to thank you for your service. But you can be on a jury and not pay attention, and not one of you has done that. You've asked incredibly good questions. Some of them we were able to answer, some of them we were not. But the questions told us exactly how closely you were tracking this case. I saw some of you have 5 notebooks of notes. That's unbelievable. The level with which you've paid attention to this case, thank you. And I really mean that. Not just for me, though, but for Mr. Johnson and his family. And Mrs. Johnson would be here, but her job wouldn't let her off today, so she actually is working right now. It's a consequence of the bills, you know. And hopefully she'll be here tomorrow, but they wouldn't give her paid leave, and they need the money to pay the bills, so I'm sorry she couldn't be here today. All right. So this case really involves three fundamental questions. And the jury verdict form we're going to go over in a little bit, and I'm going to go through all the questions. There's actually a lot more than three questions. But they really boil down to these three core issues. The first is, can Roundup be a substantial contributing factor in causing cancer? That sounds like a lot of legalese because it is. And I'm going to discuss that in detail, why we use this terminology instead of just asking, does Roundup cause cancer? The second one is, was Roundup a substantial contributing factor in causing Mr. Johnson's cancer? And finally, did Monsanto act with conscious disregard of human health? So let's tackle the first question. And before I get to this question, can Roundup be a substantial contributing factor in causing cancer, you have to understand the burden of proof here. Now, a lot of you have actual pretty robust scientific backgrounds. And that's great, because it helps you understand the science in this case. But the level required in the scientific field is not what's required in this courtroom. It's not absolute. It is something called preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. And Mr. Dickens, during jury selection, talked about a scale, right? And this is a commonly used graphic. You have two scales of evidence, and on one side, they're exactly the same, except one side has a feather on it. That is enough to meet our burden of proof. I like the quote at the bottom. It says, "I'm not sure, but I think so." And that's really the standard here. What we have to prove to you is not, yes, absolutely, it causes cancer. But you ask yourself when you're sitting in that deliberation room, maybe some of you are going to say, "I'm not so sure, but I think so." We're done. We've met our burden, and that's what's required here. Now, what do we actually have to show? That goes to the jury instruction about causation. It says a substantial factor in causing harm is a factor that a reasonable person would consider to have contributed to the harm. It must be more than a remote or trivial factor. It does not have to be the only cause of the harm. Conduct is not a substantial factor in causing harm if the same harm would have occurred without that conduct. Let me break this down a little bit. The first issue is a substantial factor. It doesn't mean it has to be the only cause of something, right? We all know cancer is a complicated disease. It's multifactorial. It's multi-causal. And we don't have to show that Roundup was the only cause of Mr. Johnson's cancer. We simply have to show that it contributed, that it played a substantial role in contributing to it. And we only have to do that more likely than not. And that's actually what we have to prove here. And in a minute, or after I'm done, after lunch, Mr. Lombardi is going to come up here and he's going to say, they have to prove this, they have to prove this, they have to prove this. Don't forget the law. Because this is not a criminal trial, as much as it feels like it at times. It's a civil one. Now, it goes on to say, conduct is not a substantial factor in causing harm if the same harm would have occurred without that conduct. The harm here, ladies and gentlemen, is that right now, Mr. Johnson has cancer. And all the horrors that that entails. And the question you have to decide is, would he be sitting here today with the cancer that he has without that contribution? It is not the question of would he develop cancer at some point down the line, 20, 30 years from now. It is, would he be where he is today absent the Roundup? Don't let the defendants, Monsanto, trick you on this point. It's really important. So, for example, if you decide that the Roundup promoted the tumors, that it contributed to the creation of his tumors on his skin, then we've met our burden. Even if he ultimately would have gotten that cancer 10, 15 years down the line. The point is, he wouldn't be here today absent the contributing factor. In addressing the issue of causation, and the general question, can Roundup be a substantial contributing factor in causing cancer? We've talked about the 3 pillars of cancer science. And you guys have heard a lot about this. You've heard about epidemiology, you've heard about toxicology, you've heard about mechanism. The weird thing is, though, you've heard that from our experts. Because here's the simple truth. Monsanto presented 4 live witnesses to you. 4. The first one was Dr. Mucci, and she only looked at the epidemiology. She refused to look at toxicology or any mechanistic data. You heard from Dr. Foster. He only looked at the animal data. He refused to look, well, he looked at the epidemiology, but he refused to opine about it or give you any opinions about it, or the mechanism data. And then you heard from Dr. Kuzel, who had looked at literally 1 epidemiology study. And then Dr. Al-Khatib, who actually had no opinions about causation whatsoever. So he's really off the table. What did they do? They atomized the science. They broke it into little parts and put everyone on their little island and said, on this island you don't have enough. But that's not science, because we actually called 5 experts. And every single one, Dr. Portier, Dr. Nugent, Dr. Sawyer, Dr. Benbrook, and Dr. Naban, looked at everything. Every animal study, they looked at every epidemiological study, they looked at the hundreds of mechanism studies. And when you look at the totality of the evidence, it causes cancer. That's what IARC did. Because if you look at just the epi, we all agree, the epi by itself, you don't get causation by itself. The rodents alone, you don't get causation. But when you put all 3 together, then you have causation. Why didn't Monsanto call somebody who could testify to all 3 topics? They didn't actually present anybody about mechanism, by the way, at all. Why didn't they call somebody? Because they couldn't find anybody. You've seen hundreds and hundreds of scientists sign their names on Dr. Portier's letter, sign their names on Dr. Blair's letter, the scientific advisory panel for the EPA. They all agree that when you look at everything, there's a risk. But why didn't they pull up a witness to say the opposite? Because they couldn't find one. Because Dr. Mucci has too much integrity that if you showed her the animal data, you got a problem. Dr. Foster, if you showed him the epi and you showed him the mechanism, probably say they got a problem. And the fact that Monsanto hasn't brought a single witness to testify about all this is glaring. It is astonishing. It shows just exactly how Monsanto likes to deal with the science. Now, the only group, person, or entity that Monsanto points to that did look at all the evidence, supposedly, is the EPA. But there's a special jury, and this is the report. It's the OP report from 2016, September 12th. And it says it's an issue paper, right? So what this was is the document that was actually sent to the scientific advisory panel for their comments. That group of, 16 scientists who reviewed the merits of this document. But here's the instruction. The following exhibits may be admitted for the limited purpose of evaluating Monsanto's state of mind regarding the state of science, and for no other purpose. This instruction does not apply to the IARC monograph. You can look at that document and you can believe the truth of the statements made in it, but you cannot believe the truth of this document. It has not been admitted for that purpose. And the reason why is a really important one. Because Monsanto didn't put anyone in this stand right here to talk to you about it intelligently. We didn't get to cross-examine the guy who authored this. Ask him, hey, why did you do this? Why did you violate your EPA guidelines? They didn't put anyone up there because they know if they did, I would have torn that person apart. And I wouldn't have been my criticisms. It would have been the scientific advisory panel's criticisms. They didn't follow their own guidelines. And Dr. Foster, he goes, well, it's guidelines. You know, people, sometimes you go outside the guidelines. That's not science, okay? Science is not sticking an arrow in a wall and drawing a bullseye around it. Guidelines dictate how you do things and how you look at it and how you assess it, how you weight things. And the only thing that the independent scientists that reviewed this document agreed on, all across the board, was that the EPA didn't follow their guidelines. That's what this document says. Now, why is that? Why is it that this document is given limited significance and was highly criticized by the Scientific Advisory Panel? Well, I have a couple theories. The first one is the EPA approved this product in 1970s. It's been on the market for 40 years. And the scientists that approved it would have to go and tell everybody in the world, we got it wrong. They have a dog in the fight. Because they'd have to tell the world, we made a mistake. That the countless cancers that this product has caused in the United States, my bad. They'd have to own up to that. And even after the Scientific Advisory Panel said, hey, you ain't following your guidelines. You ain't doing it right. They just doubled down on it. They didn't explain anything. And that's why the 2017 report is not in evidence. And that's why the SAP panel, Monsanto didn't put that in evidence. They only want you to see this little part of the story. And even this part of the story is limited. I think everybody here can agree that no one's perfect. But the EPA has made mistakes before. Government agencies make mistakes. We've heard time and time again about the various things that we found out were cancer after decades, if not hundreds of years of thinking they were safe. We've heard about it over and over again. And that's what's going on here. It's also important to realize on page 19 of this document, it says unequivocally that although there are multiple lines of evidence, although there are studies available on glyphosate-based pesticide formulations, the agency is soliciting advice from the FIFRA SAP on this evaluation of human carcinogenic potential for the active ingredient glyphosate only at this time. So while they list a bunch of the formulated studies, which most of them are positive for what it's worth, they actually don't offer an opinion about the formulated product. I mean, just think about how is that possible? I mean, they're approving a product. They know it's being used in a formulated way in the real world, and they're not even looking at it. Finally, I'm going to put together a story that has come out in the videos but maybe wasn't clearly explained. That's Jess Rowland. Now, Jess Rowland authored the first version of this. You saw that. It was presented to you. What do we know about Jess Rowland? This is an email. It's in evidence. And it's from Daniel Jenkins. It's to William Haydens and a bunch of other ones. And it's just after the IARC classification. It's in April 2015. And he says, so Jess called me out of the blue this morning. This is Jess Rowland. And here's what Jenkins says. He actually quotes him. And by the way, this is April 2015. So what's happened at this point is IARC's announced a two-way classification, but they haven't actually published the monograph. They actually haven't shown anybody the reasoning behind their decision. They just posted it. They just said we did two-way. So before the monograph comes out, Jess Rowland says, we have enough to sustain our conclusions. Don't need gene tox or epi. The only thing is the Cheminova study. By the way, that's the Tumor study, the one that has the mystery virus that no one seems to know where it came from, with the sarcoma in mice. We have that study now, and its conclusions are irrelevant. Because at limit dose, I'm the chair of the CARC, and my folks are running this process for glyphosate and registration review. I have called a CARC meeting in June. So we have the guy who's writing the document calling Monsanto, asking questions about how to get rid of an animal study. That's what this is saying. And he's saying we're going to disagree with IARC even before we've seen the monograph. That's not science. I don't know what that is. That's creepy. I mean, that's the person who's doing the EPA's evaluation. But then it gets worse. Because at this time, the ATSDR, which Dr. Portier used to run, by the way, not at this time, but he used to run it when he was working for the federal government, decided to run a review on glyphosate. They were looking specifically at the carcinogenic potential. And here's what he says. Jess called to ask for a contact name at ATSDR. I passed on Jesselyn's email. That's the person at ATSDR. He told me no coordination is going on, and he wanted to establish some, saying, quote, if I can kill this, I should get a medal. This is the person in the EPA, the person who's supposed to be looking out for our health, bragging to a Monsanto employee that he's going to kill something, another person's investigation of it. And if he does it, he should get a medal. You have to put the EPA's assessment in context, because the EPA's assessment is not transparent. We don't get to see the emails and conversations between Monsanto and EPA. But you know what is transparent? 100%. Everything's public, published, available to the world. It's IARC's classification. And they looked at all the evidence and they rated it. Epi is limited, which means that it's a credible causal association, but you can't rule out chance or bias. Toxicology is sufficient, it's the highest possible rating. And the mechanism is strong, highest possible rating. And the fact that Monsanto has not called a single witness to discuss mechanism with you, this is undisputed. It is the strongest piece of evidence of carcinogenicity, and Monsanto didn't call a witness to talk about it. I mean, they brought in for these little specialized, the epi person, the animal person. So they could have brought in a mechanism person, but they didn't even bother. Because if they had brought in an expert to try to tell you that the mechanism data was not strong or didn't support causation, it would have been a disaster for them. I would have put study after study after study after study in front of them and said, sir, how can you say that? Let's look at the studies very quickly. You guys have heard all about this already. I don't want to belabor all the evidence. If I need to address some things that they bring up in rebuttal, I will. Just so you know, we're going to go till 12:15 today with me. Then Mr. Lombardi is going to go for 2 hours after lunch, and then I will have the last 45 minutes or so to respond to his arguments. That's how it's going to work. And you should probably start deliberations tomorrow morning. This is the epi data, right? And we have something that no one disputes. Whether or not you have an adjustment for pesticides or not adjusted for other pesticides, whatever you do, it's all to the right of all to the right of one. Every single time it's to the right of one, with the exception of Orsi, which everyone agrees is kind of an unuseful study because it's a hospital-based study. And most of these, with the exception of DeRusso 5, which is the AHS, most of these are population-based. So they're not just looking at farmers spraying and industrial cabs. They're looking at people actually using it in the real world. And it's all to the right of one. I asked Dr. Foster about it. Remember I put up my notebook and I drew a line and I put X's on both sides of the line and I said, if there was no risk, you'd expect to see some above and below the line just by random chance, right? And he goes, yeah. And I said, but here, it's all to the right. What's the likelihood of that? And he goes, nah, it's pretty unexpected. He conceded that. That was their own witness. And Dr. Portier actually calculated the probability of this occurring. It's like 1 out of, I think it's 3% chance. So if there's truly no risk, and this is the data you're seeing, the likelihood of seeing this data is 3%. It's a basic probability sign equation. We also have dose response. Sorry, it's not on here. But for both the McDuffie, it showed that greater than 2 days per year use had a more than doubling of the risk, and it was statistically significant. Now they've complained that it wasn't adjusting for confounders, but if you actually look at the study, and I showed Dr. Mucci, they looked at this issue and they said none of the other pesticides are contributing to it. So there's a dose response there. In Erickson 2008, there was also a greater than 10 days per year analysis, and again, that was doubling and statistically significant. In the Andreotti, there was an intensity weighted measurement. I don't have it on here, and that one was negative. It was all below 1. Which, by the way, is very weird, right? Studies should not be consistently below 1, but in any event, all 4 of those metrics were below 1, which we'll explain why that is in a second. So in any event, there's a lot of evidence here about the epidemiology. But let's be clear. Nobody is saying it gets you there. Nobody. Dr. Portier, Dr. Nugent, nobody says it gets you there. And IARC himself concluded it was limited. So if you were just to look at the epidemiology and block everything else out, that's not proper science. So let's move on to the rest. Well, let's talk about some of the criticisms. We'll do this pretty quickly because I don't want to spend too much time. They really raised 3 issues in the case. One was confounding. The second was proxy bias. And then the argument was, well, you have to look at the NAP and the AHS, right? Those are the other issues at stake here. So let's go through those pretty quickly. On confounding, it's not an issue here, Okay? In DeRusse 2003, they examined 47 different pesticides. They looked at whether or not there was any confounding, and they said there was not. And that's primarily the data this is based on. So the idea that there's confounding, it's just garbage. And it's out of a playbook, okay? This is what Dr. Mucci agreed to. I said, doctor, you said that one of the great accomplishments of epidemiology was that it helped expose that tobacco was associated with lung cancer, right? Yes. And isn't it true that when that fight was happening in the epidemiological world, the tobacco companies kept saying, it's confounders? Maybe, I'm sure they did, yes. It's a classic way of hiding a risk.
Objection, Your Honor. Beyond the scope of the evidence, there's no evidence about anything other than Monsanto in this case.
All right, sustained.
Let's look at another document. This is Exhibit 321, also in evidence. This is an email from Dr. Goldstein. The subject is ACSH. It's an organization. And he says, well, I would love to have more friends and more choices. By the way, this is in February 2015, just before the IR classification. Well, I would like to have more friends and more choices. We don't have a lot of supporters and can't afford to lose the few we have. I'm well aware of the challenges of ACSH. And I know Eric has some valid concerns, so I can assure you I'm not all starry-eyed about ACSH. But they have plenty of warts, but you will not get a better value for your dollar than ACSH. Now, out of context, this email doesn't tell you much. So I asked Dr. Benbrook to tell us about ACSH, and here's what he said. The ACSH, what position did they take with regard to tobacco? They were one of the scientific organizations that held out to the end and argued that the science really wasn't clear about tobacco causing cancer. Question, talked about how too many confounders, right? Answer, that's certainly one of the arguments that's brought up. That Monsanto is now raising confounders on this data, that they seek the allegiance of ACSH, should tell you a lot. Let's move on to the next problem, proxy bias. Now, I had the slides in here, but I don't have enough time to get through it all. We looked at a study by Dr. Blair from 1993. It was during Dr. Mucci's cross-examination. I put it up there and I showed her the portion when they discussed the issue of proxy bias. And basically what they said was, when you talk to proxies, they tend to underestimate the use of pesticides, right? And so if you add that to your data, it will tend to underestimate exposures. And what that does is it creates classification exposure, misclassification exposure error. And what that does is it doesn't inflate risks. It pushes it towards 1. That's what it does. Now, Dr. Mucci, she took a remarkable position. She said, you have to exclude them from your analysis completely. That's insane. You're looking at people who have cancer, and you're going to cut out everyone who's already died? That is the definition of selection bias, right? How can you estimate a risk when you ignore the data from the people who've already died from the disease? Of course, if you do that, your risk's going to disappear. But that's not how this works. People who have cancer die. And in epidemiological studies, you ask their next of kin for as much information as you can. But you adjust for it. You don't remove it. And when you adjust for proxy bias in this data, nothing happens. It actually gets a little bit less. It attenuates towards the null. So there's absolutely no evidence of any true proxy bias here. And Dr. Mucci's reliance on excluding it altogether from the data is just a rampant violation of basic epidemiological principles. And so what would happen is if you were properly dealing with proxy bias, if we didn't have proxy bias, as they say, these data would actually be closer to 1. It would not be greater. And so the existence of proxy respondents and the fact that we still see a risk actually strengthens the evidence. All right, let's talk about the North American Pooled Project. And what I can only describe is a fit of, I don't know what's going on here. Monsanto keeps trying to argue that the NAP supports their position. It simply doesn't. It just doesn't. Let's look at the document. This is the actual draft manuscript This is the last one, September 21st, 2015. This is the draft that was there. It's the same authors that we've talked about, we've seen in a bunch of other studies. And what are the results that they report? Cases who ever used glyphosate had a significantly elevated risk of NHL overall. Odds ratio of 1.43, statistically significant. And that's adjusting for proxies, confounders, and all the stuff that Dr. Mucci said you had to have. Subjects who used glyphosate for greater than 3.5 years had increased SLL risk. Odds ratio, again, that's not statistically significant, but it's elevated. And those who handled glyphosate for greater than 2 days a year, remember, this is dose makes the poison, right? So it's greater than 2 days a year, had significantly elevated odds of NHL overall. 2.42 statistically significant. These were suggestive increases. P-trends. So it's statistically increasing by rate in risk of NHL overall, FL and SLL with more days of glyphosate use. The data in the study says it supports there's a problem here. And again, don't take my word. This is quite literally what it says about IARC. It says our results are also aligned with findings from epidemiological studies of other populations that found an elevated risk of NHL for glyphosate exposure and with a greater number of days per year of glyphosate use, as well as a meta-analysis of glyphosate use and NHL risk. From an epidemiological perspective, our results were supportive of the IARC evaluation of glyphosate as a probable group 2A carcinogen for NHL. I don't know where they're getting this idea that the NAP somehow makes it weaker. And the simple fact is, this was not published. It's never been published. It's still in the process of being published. We don't actually know what's going on. But it was never published. So IARC could never actually look at it. They didn't consider the data. And if they had, it would have strengthened their conclusion. It would have strengthened the epidemiological evidence, not weaken it. Finally, let's talk about the AHS. The AHS is what it is. It is a cohort study. It's pretty big for a cohort study. It's looking at professional pesticide applicators. And what we know is the people who entered the study, right, were people who had been spraying for over 16 years, and none of them had cancer. So the population begins off with people who are clearly resistant to cancer. And that's the starting basis of the population. And from there, we follow them for 20 years. And it's still going. We'll follow them and hopefully until the end of time, and we'll see what the data shows. And over 80% of them are spraying glyphosate and other pesticides, right? And in addition to all that, Mr. Lombardi will point out to you, and we'll hear repeatedly, that the risks of NHL started long before glyphosate hit the market for farmers, for this population. So we're dealing with people who are resistant, people who are already at increased risks of NHL. And that's really important to understand, right? Because when the numbers in the control group are elevated, so let's say it's 0, 1, 3, 5, right? There's a clear pattern there. But if we add 5 to each of those, so it's 5, 6, 8, 10, statistical significance disappears because of the noise. When you start adding a bunch of more cases, it's harder to see risks. And that's what we're seeing in the AHS. Remarkably, you don't have to take my word for it. In evidence is Exhibit 154, and it was brought in by stipulation, so you really haven't had a chance to look at it. But it came in through the cross of Dr. Mucci. And this is a document created by John Aquavella, Monsanto's epidemiologist at the time, from July 22nd, 1997. They're talking about the AHS, and this is before they have any data, right? So this is them just talking about the study before any results come in. And as you read through this document, they're scared. They're not scared that they're going to get data that supports that it doesn't cause cancer. They're worried they're going to get data that shows that it causes cancer. And so Dr. Aquavella goes on a tirade describing how bad the study is. For example, one of his criticisms is most of the diseases to be studied in the AHS have scant reasoning to link them putatively to pesticide exposure. Thus, much of the research can be termed exploratory. Now, that should be amusing to a lot of people here because in a minute, Mr. Lombardi is going to come up here and tell you that every study but the AHS is exploratory. And this is their own person saying that it is exploratory. It's sort of an amusing contradiction. That's not unusual in epidemiology, but it is unusual on this big of a scale. By the way, this is Exhibit 154. Read the whole thing cover to cover. It's pretty amusing. Because it's Monsanto basically strongly criticizing the AHS before they get the results. And yet they have the audacity to come in here and say it's the greatest study since sliced bread. And they're going to do that in a second in their closing. But here's the part that's really interesting. Under the exposure assessment, Dr. Acquavella says the exposure assessment in the AHS will be inaccurate. It will be. And we know why, right? I showed you guys the questionnaire that people had to fill out in 25 minutes after they just took an exam. And literally, amongst the 47, 80 pesticides or whatever that they're looking at, there's one little section about Roundup, and it asks them on the spot to not only decide if they've ever used it, how much they use it daily per year for the last 16 years. They have no access to their records. They can't call their spouse and say, hey, did I use Roundup last year? What was that project we did? They can't do any of that. They just have to pick something on the spot. And so you're going to get misclassification. People are going to say they were exposed who really weren't. People are going to say they were much more exposed when they really weren't exposed, and vice versa. People are going to say they weren't exposed when they really were exposed. And what happens in a cohort study when you have all that crossing is it just destroys any ability to actually see anything. Don't take my word for it. Inaccurate exposure classification can produce spurious results. The conventional thinking in epidemiology is that exposure misclassification will most often obscure exposure-disease relationships. I mean, this is what he's saying before he gets the results. So because of this issue, concerned about this, they actually studied it. Right? The AHS investigators looked at this issue. And they published an article about it. It's called The Impact of Pesticide Exposure Misclassification on Estimates of Relative Risks in the Agricultural Health Study. Dr. Blair and all the other people, many of them are on the current AHS publication, right? They actually looked at this exact issue, this issue of exposure misclassification. And what did they find? I covered this with Dr. Nugent. And what they found was, we draw several conclusions. First, the accuracy of reporting of pesticides is comparable to that of many other factors commonly assessed by questionnaire for epidemiological studies. Second, except in situations where exposure estimation is quite accurate, which we know here it wasn't that accurate, but assuming it was, and true relative risks are 3 or more, which we do not have here, right? We're talking about relative risks about 1.5 to 2. Pesticide misclassification may diminish risk estimates to such an extent that no association is obvious, which indicates false negative findings might be common. The investigators addressed this issue in a publication, and they said, listen, unless you have a really high risk rate because of exposure misclassification, you ain't going to see anything. So what do we know about Roundup? We know that it has about a 2.0, maybe 1.5 to 2.0 risk. You're not going to see it in the AHS. And they never did. Right? It was published in 2005. They didn't see any risk there. They did find an elevated rate, oddly enough, with multiple myeloma, which is now considered a form of NHL. But that was it. And then they published it again in 2018, the JNCI paper. We call it the Andreotti paper. Whatever you want to call it, I don't care. And again, they saw no risk with NHL overall, although they did, interestingly enough, see an elevated risk for T-cell lymphoma, which, oddly enough, is exactly what Mr. Johnson has. But they studied this. They looked at it and they said that you won't see it. So we know, before ever seeing the results from the AHS, that it won't show a risk unless it's really high. So it's not really compelling evidence that there's no risk. It's compelling evidence that the AHS is being properly predicted by the people who ran it. And you heard from Dr. Blair. He ran the IARC monograph. He ran the AHS. Yet he concluded it caused cancer. That should be it. They cited Claire-Anne DeRoos. She's on the JNCI paper, but she also signed a letter with Dr. Portier saying, IARC got it right. This stuff causes cancer. I mean, this idea that the AHS is some profound study that answers the question that we've been trying to solve this whole time is just not true. It tells us exactly what we knew it would, not much. Compounded into this problem with the AHS, separate and apart from the misclassification issue is, well, it's actually related, but it's the change in use in the product, right? We know starting, the first questionnaire was between 1993 and 1997. This is glyphosate use amongst agricultural workers, so this is the same population, right? Then they did a follow-up study between 2001 and 2005, and that's where they lost 40% of their data and had to impute it. And there's all these problems associated with the imputation. You've heard testimony about it. I really don't want to belabor it. The simple fact is, even if you use 2005, it's still doubled since, right? So what's going on is you're studying a pesticide that's just had a gargantuan increase in use. You can't do that. It just doesn't work. It breaks the system. It breaks the model. And that's what they all agreed to. Now, remarkably, Dr. Mucci said, oh, it shouldn't make any difference. But it's actually not true. If you actually look at the study, and maybe I'll show it to you on rebuttal if I have to, but on the last page it says, if there has been changes of use in the product, it will affect the results. Everyone agrees that there has been. Probably the most kind of a basic point, though, is that the IARC monograph spent a lot of time discussing the AHS. You'll have it in evidence to take a look at. They discussed it. They looked at the DeRoos 2005 data. They discussed its strengths, its weaknesses. It was fully considered, and they concluded, IARC concluded it was negative, right? So the biggest attack on IARC is, well, now they have the new AHS. Well, the new AHS is negative, right? So it was negative when they came to their conclusion. It's negative now. It wouldn't have impacted the results. It just wouldn't have. It's the same study. And so this idea that IARC didn't consider all the epidemiology, it's just not true. All right. So those are the reasons that they attack epidemiology. Let's quickly go through the mouse studies. I don't want to spend too much time on it. IARC classified it as sufficient. But let's look at what the charts show. So let's start off with the rats. Monsanto to this day has only offered evidence about the skin keratoxanthomas and just refuses to offer any testimony about, the repeated thyroid tumors or the fact that there's a kidney carcinoma. Here we also see that in mice, so it crosses species. Some of these, sure, we agree probably aren't a big deal. And Dr. Portier, when he said, pick and choose which ones you have to rely on, he told you which ones were the strongest. And probably the most interesting one, I think, for this case is the skin one. And the reason why is not because it's a carcinoma. It's not. It's a benign tumor. But that it shows that it creates tumors in the skin. We're dealing right now with a man who has tumors in his skin. His are not benign, but they exist. And it shows that there is a plausible mechanism. It's called biological plausibility. But the rat studies really aren't the crazy one. The really intense one is the mouse data. And here we see the kidney ones popping up again. So this is a cross-species identification, which is something that's really important in assessing the animal data. And the Monsanto study is the first one. But every single study after Monsanto looked at it found some form of malignant lymphoma. Every single one. And you saw Monsanto try to explain it away. They had Dr. Foster go up there and he said, listen, all of these, yeah, sure, but they're all within the historical range of 12%. He put a little chart up. He said it over and over and over again. But then at the very end of his examination, I showed him the actual data, and he went, yep, I'm wrong. So the actual basis of his opinion is just wrong. It's not 12%, it's 4%. That's what the data shows. And so instead of seeing 6 tumors in every group, the max you would see is 2. And that's really, really important in understanding this. Because Dr. Foster and even the EPA, oddly enough, they do the same thing. They dismiss all the malignant lymphoma because they say it's within the range of historical controls. Now, we know that's a violation of the guidelines. The guidelines say you don't do that. They never explain why they do it, but they do that. Putting aside them violating the guidelines, Dr. Portier clearly shows that it's popping up over and over again. And this case is about lymphoma. You're seeing the very tumor in the mice that that you're seeing in humans. It's the parallels of the data are overwhelming. And if you were to just look at the epi and just look at the animal data, you might not connect the dots. But when you look at both, like our experts did, it's pretty clear that there's something going on here, specifically with lymphoma, with a cancer that starts in the bones and manifests all over your body in different tumor sites. IR concluded it was sufficient. Now, one of the things that I think came up, and we didn't really get to talk about it too much because it really came out through Dr. Foster's testimony, is this idea of the ways that carcinogenesis happens. We have an initiator, right? That's something that directly causes damaged DNA. And then after that, you damage them enough, it eventually can mutate in the cells and cause cancer, right? But another way something causes cancer is something called a promoter. And the promoter affects all the other aspects of it. It doesn't initiate it, but it takes initiated cells and progresses them quicker towards a tumor. And both types of carcinogens are accepted and understood. And there's actually a way to test if something is a promoter. There's actually a specific, it's called a promoter test. And there's only been one that's ever been done on glyphosate. It actually wasn't glyphosate, it was actually done on Roundup. It was done on mice and skin. It's called the George study from 2010. And it was done by some scientists in India. And there were some questions, I think, about, what was the vehicle and was there a vehicle control? So let me just walk you through that very quickly. So this is the study. This is the studies on glyphosate-induced carcinogenicity in mouse skin. So they're doing a skin tumor promoter study. A protemic, or I actually don't know what that means, sorry. Anyway, they do an analysis. Glyphosate is widely used. Here we showed the carcinogenic effects of glyphosate using a two-stage mouse skin carcinogenesis model and protemic analysis. Carcinogenicity study revealed that glyphosate has tumor-promoting activity. All right, so let me show you what they actually did so you don't have to take my word for it. Now we know they specifically used Roundup, specifically Roundup Original from Monsanto Company, St. Louis, Missouri. So it's the same stuff here, has the 41% glyphosate and the POEA surfactant, same thing that Mr. Johnson was using, okay? And they broke it into a bunch of different groups. But the groups that we're interested in are the first two and the last one. So what they do in these studies is they actually give the, they take the mouse and they actually give it an initiator, right? Something we know causes cancer as an initiator. And then they apply the substance like glyphosate to it to see if it promotes the initiation. So was it a promotional effect? And they break it into a bunch of them. So the DMBA is an initiator, but they also have DMBA plus TPA. And TPA is specifically a promoter. We know it's a promoter. So this is a complete example. So you'd have a known initiator and a known promoter, right? But they also, in group 2, did glyphosate alone. And with glyphosate alone, they used the vehicle, which is the substance that gets mixed with it to apply it to the mouse. And that was the issue about the vehicle. It was 50% ethanol and acetone, 50% solution. And so they did glyphosate just had the vehicle in it. And so they looked at what would happen if you just put glyphosate on it without any initiator. But also down here, they did the initiator and then applied glyphosate 1 week later by topical treatment 3 times a week, okay? So we actually have a control for the vehicle. And what does it show? Here are the table. Here's the results. It shows that that group that just had glyphosate had no tumors, 0 across the board. So it was not initiating tumors in this relatively short mouse study on the skin. And the one that had the absolute initiator plus the known promoter, it had 100% of the animals had tumors in it, okay, in their skin, because there was a known promoter, a known initiator, and known promoter. But when you give it a known initiator and glyphosate, 40% of the animals had tumors. So what does that tell you? It's a pretty complicated issue. But basically what it tells you is that glyphosate is clearly promoting tumors, right? Because even when they had just the DMBA, the initiator by itself, there was no tumors, right? So glyphosate is doing something. Not as aggressive as TPA, but it's doing something. And 40% of them had tumors in their skin. Now, Dr. Foster dismissed this, and actually the IARC didn't consider it as well, and EPA doesn't consider it, mostly because there's only 20 animals in the group, even though it's still statistically significant, so you don't ignore that. But also because they didn't do a full histopathical examination. They didn't cut apart each of those tumors to see if they were carcinogenic. Okay, fine. But it doesn't negate what the data does show. It shows that glyphosate, when applied to the skin, induces the promotions of tumors. That's literally what it shows. And this is the only promotional study that's been published and shown. And it's overwhelmingly obvious what it shows.
Mr. Wisner, we need to take the morning recess now.
Perfect, Ron.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 15-minute recess now, so we'll be in recess for 15 minutes until 11:25. Please remember, do not discuss the case, do not do any research on the case. We'll resume again at 11:25. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now continue with closing arguments by Mr. Wisner. So, Mr. Wisner, when you're ready, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right. I just want to show you another document. It's in evidence 366. This is an email sent from Ashley Roberts at Intertech to Dr. Farmer and Dr. Heidens, two of the people you've seen testify to in this case. Just so you know, Donna Farmer, she in her testimony, she actually said she considers herself the spokesperson for Monsanto on safety issues and Roundup. And Dr. Heidens is her boss. So that all came out in the testimony, and I just want to point that out because one of the issues in punitive damages is, were these individuals considered managing agents sufficient to either speak for the company, or the instructions say what the elements are. They clearly do, but I just want to point that out. So Ashley Roberts sends an email to Donna and Bill. He goes, he's talking about Keith, who asked a question. He goes, he has asked if we need to give any consideration to exposures of formulants in the commercial product, at least in applicators. I was under the impression these were inert, but reading a response this morning in The Ecologist makes it sound like it's the combination that is toxic, right? So in response to this question from a colleague who's in the process of writing a paper that Monsanto is going to publish, essentially refuting IARC, here's what he says. He goes, Ashley, I think the short answer is no. The focus of this is what is the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate. And this is a thing we see frequently, just focus on glyphosate, not the formulant. But then he says something that's particularly revealing. That said, the surfactant in the formulation will come up in the tumor promotion skin study. It's the one we were just talking about. Because we think it played a role there. This is actually an admission by their chief top dog toxicologist at Monsanto, saying that George study that we just discussed, yeah, we think the fact that it was a formulated product played a role in the promotion of skin tumors. This is 2015, August. It's important because Mr. Johnson, at this point, we're going to go through his timeline in a second, is actually currently actively spraying Roundup at this time at the Benicia School ground. And at this time, he is still waiting for a response from his second phone call. So that's the context of this. All right. So we've looked at the does it cause cancer. I think we've got it. I'll respond to whatever the defense counsel brings up in rebuttal. First question, can it be a substantial contributing factor? Yes. Question, next one. Was it a substantial contributing factor in Mr. Johnson's cancer? And before I get into this, I'm just going to quickly address a couple of the big issues. The first one is something called latency. And Monsanto wants you to believe that the minimum amount of time between exposure and diagnosis for mycosis fungoides because of a pesticide exposure is, it keeps changing what their number is. I think on the opening it was like 12 years. I don't know what he's going to say now. Maybe it's 6. I don't know. The simple fact is there is no minimum latency for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that is more than 4 months. That's the minimum latency. You don't have to take my word on that. That is the number come up by the 9/11 Commission after exposure to chemicals from the 9/11 incident. They said 4 months is the minimum amount. That's it. Because Dr. Sawyer explained very clearly that it's a curve, right? And if it's a lot of exposure, then it's slanted this way. If it's lower exposure, it's slanted that way. But it's a curve. And some people will get cancer in a few months. Some will get cancer in 4 months. And some will get cancer in 25, 30 years, right? But between those two extremes is everybody else. And you have to consider exposures and other potential risk factors. And for Mr. Johnson, there wasn't any. The only thing he had as a risk factor was the fact that he's an African American. That's it. Everything else he didn't have for mycosis fungoides, except he had extreme exposures to Roundup for 2 years, or 2 spraying seasons. There's this big fight about, did he have a rash starting in 2013 or early 2014? It's the fall of 13, early 14. It doesn't matter. It's the most bizarre fight I've ever had in a courtroom because he had 2 full spraying seasons, right? That's plenty of exposure to get cancer. And so whether it started in the fall or not is irrelevant, although the records don't support that it's in the fall. So in any event, it's a red herring. It's a non-issue. All right, so here's the instruction again on substantial contributing factor. And the same instruction that applies to general causation applies to specific causation. And that is, do you think that it's likely, more likely than not, 51%, that Mr. Johnson's cancer was at least contributed to substantially by his Roundup exposure? That's the question. If you think yes, we're done. We've proven this element. Let's quickly run through the chronology here. I got 15 minutes before I have to get to the last part of this, so let's see if I can do this. All right, so Mr. Johnson is promoted to Integrator Pest Manager June 2012. He has an entire spraying season, and he testified, and there's been no contravailing evidence to this fact, that his machine that he was using was putting out about 50 gallons an hour. He'd go through 3 full tanks in a morning. Now, they did bring up Dr. Al-Khatib, who said, no, that's not how it works. And then I literally showed him printouts from the internet that said the opposite. And he goes, no, but that's for something else. But his opinion was literally based on this photograph. That's it. He was paid $70,000, and he looked at a photograph and said, it's 12 gallons an hour. That's not evidence. That's just rampant speculation. We heard from Mr. Johnson that he'd go through 3 full tanks in the morning, and a tank has 50 gallons. It doesn't take rocket science. He was going through about 150 gallons per spraying session, and he'd have about 40 of them in the summer months and intermittently in between. So going through here, we have intermittent spraying. And then we enter his second spraying season. This is the May of 2013. He starts spraying again, and during this time period, we don't know the exact date, he has the Mary Farmer incident. So he's at the Mary Farmer School District, and that's when he's pulling the hose on the machine and he's spraying it everywhere, and it's getting everywhere, and he's spraying it, and something goes wrong. And it pops off of the machine, and it's shooting out a bunch of Roundup. And what does he do? He gets all over him. But the first thing he does is he actually creates a dirt pile to prevent it from going down the slope because he doesn't want the children to be exposed to it. And after he's drenched in it, he finally gets the machine, turns it off, and he's drenched. I mean, head to toe, all over his body. And what does he do? He drives back to his office, which is not there, a couple miles away, gets there, gets into the office, takes off his clothes, and he wipes himself off. And he doesn't take a shower for another 6 hours. So he's getting just an incredible amount of exposure during this incident, sometime during the summer of 2013. We don't know exactly what happened. And this is obviously in addition to his just regular drift exposure that he happens when he's spraying. So he completes it in August of 2013. And this is where this mystery rash issue comes from. But the simple fact is, he went and saw a doctor for wasp stings in September 2013. And he's there for stings, and we read into the record, from a medical record, negative for rash. So he actually gets a physical examination from doctors at the time, and it doesn't omit anything about a rash. It literally says negative for rash. Now, Dr. Kuzel took the stand and said he had a rash on his face, and on the side of his neck at this time. How could any doctor, looking at a person's rash on their face, write into a medical record negative for rash if there was a rash there? There just wasn't. The only treating physician to have testified in this case, the only one, is Dr. Ofodole. She came out here on her own dime to testify from Atlanta because she cared so much about Mr. Johnson. And she said, yeah, that there's no evidence that it actually started in 2013. That her record, when she said it was a year prior, it was late in the day, and if he had a rash, he would have come into the hospital because he was very good about seeking treatment when he was injured. So that's the testimony. Separately, there's another medical examination in December, a few months later, and the medical record says no deformity, no shift, no scarring, no swelling. Again, no mention of any rash. In February of 2014, this is when he has his second sort of mishap at work. At this point, he's using a backpack sprayer for some reason. He only used it a couple times, but one of the few times he did, it leaked through his suit and actually saturated his whole back. And he actually thought it was sweat, and until he realized, oh my God, I'm literally drenched in Roundup. We don't know how long he was exposed for. It could have been for an hour or two. We don't know. So that happened in February of 2014. And then the first evidence of any serious rash is May of 2014. So it's a few months after. And if, in fact, Roundup is a promoter, this is kind of what you would expect, right? You'd start expecting the tumors to start manifesting after you've had repeated exposures, after his second season and another major exposure. You'd start seeing it occur. After following several biopsies, he's finally diagnosed, well, sort of diagnosed. It's a preliminary diagnosis in August of 2014. And his final diagnosis was actually made by Dr. Ofodole, who testified here, and that was in October of 2014. And this is what he looked like, okay? You can see by October 2014, he has plaques all over his skin, on his leg, on his chest. There's some stuff on his face. There is absolutely zero evidence that he had this in the fall of 2013. But again, I stress, it doesn't matter. So this is what he looks like. After October 2014, we have that same month when he's diagnosed, IARC says they're going to look at glyphosate. All right? And we have an internal email from Dr. Heidens talking about the IARC evaluations being sent to Dr. Farmer. And in this email, he acknowledges, at this time, we have vulnerability in the area of epidemiology. We also have potential vulnerabilities in the other areas that IARC will consider, namely exposure, gene toxin, mode of action. If there is a force working against glyphosate, there is ample fodder to string together to help the cause, even though it's not scientifically justified in its purest form. I don't know what that means, purest form. But anyway, this is what he says in October of 2014. This is in response to IARC saying they're going to look at it. A month later, Mr. Johnson calls Monsanto. So we have their main toxicologist saying, yeah, we have vulnerabilities here. There's a lot of science showing a risk. And he calls them. He told me he works for a school district in California, and about 9 months ago, February that year, had a hose break on a large tank sprayer. This resulted in him being soaked to the skin on his face, neck, and head with Ranger Pro. He said he was wearing a white exposure suit and even went inside that. A few months after this incident, he noticed a rash, again, a few months after February 2014, which would be consistent with what we know to be true, on his knee, then on his face, and later on the side of his head. He has changed his laundry detergent, dryer sheets, and used all creams available to him, but nothing seemed to help. His entire body is covered in this now, and the doctors are saying it's skin cancer. He's just trying to find out if it all could be related to such a large exposure to Ranger Pro. He asks. Dr. Goldstein says, I'll call him, and we know he never did. After this, February 2015, Monsanto starts plotting how it's going to deal with the IARC ruling. Here's another email from Dr. Heidens to Dr. Farmers and others. And in this email, they're talking about creating science. And he specifically says a less expensive, more palatable approach might be to involve experts only for the areas of contention, epidemiology, and possibly MOA, depending on what comes out of the IARC meeting. And we ghostwrite the exposure toxin genotox session. He says ghostwrite. And this is the guy in 2015 saying, we're going to ghostwrite. He goes on, an option would be to add these people's names to the publication, but we would be keeping costs down by us doing the writing, and they would just edit and sign their name, so to speak. Recall, that's how we handled Williams-Crow's 2000. He says, yeah, remember that's how we ghostwrote that thing 15 years ago. And we know that that was relevant because in Exhibit 373, they say, this is in 2010, Williams has served us well in toxicology over the last decade. They create the science and then cite to it. So this is in February of 2015. They come up with a plan. This is dated February 23rd, 2015. It's before IARC's classification, preparedness and engagement plan. First point is to protect the reputation and freedom to operate of Roundup by communicating the safety of glyphosate. They want their freedom to operate, which means no regulation, sell to whoever they want, make billions. And this is before the monograph has come out, okay? So they don't even know what the result's going to be. They don't even know what the monograph's going to say, what data they relied upon. And they plan to orchestrate outcry with the IARC decision. That's not science, okay? You don't plan to attack an adverse scientific ruling before you've seen it. That's called deliberate disregard for human health. I got no problem with a company making money. This is America. But I got a problem when they don't do it honestly. And that's what this is showing. This is February of 2015. A month later, a few weeks later, IR classification comes out. And then just 3 weeks later, Mr. Johnson calls again. A second time, he reaches out to them and says, hey guys, I need some help here. He goes on, and I'm not going to read all of this, but he describes in detail that he's been using it for his job, that he's been spraying with a 50-gallon tank. He talks about the mixtures that he's using. He's talking about his protective equipment. He states he continues to get unexplained rashes and nodules all over his body. The caller's level of fear is rising over his continued use of Ranger Pro. One phone call. That's all it took. Just one phone call to tell this guy, hey, you know what? There's some signs that say it might cause cancer. This is what he looked like in March 2015. And as you can see, it's getting much worse. We got plaques all over his body, lesions on his arms and legs. This is the sarcoma one that we found out later. It's not the MF. It's on his head. You can see it's breaking. So he reaches out to them. And because Monsanto hasn't said anything to him, Dr. Ofodole actually writes a letter to the Benicia School District saying, hey, maybe he should stop spraying it. Now, Monsanto's going to come in here and they're going to tell you that all of his treating physicians don't think Roundup caused this cancer. And that is a flat-out lie. Flat-out lie. The only person who's testified was Dr. Ofodole. That's the only person. And what Dr. Ofodole says is she told him to stop spraying it. Yeah, she doesn't know for sure if it caused it, but she's sure concerned. Concerned enough to write a letter. Then in May, a few months later, Monsanto creates a new plan. This is worth taking a look at. What we see here is, why do more? They're talking about how to respond to IARC. They concede that there's a severe stigma associated with it. And they need to provide new science to provide additional support, air cover for future regulatory reviews. They needed to combat the STDR evaluation. We talked about that with Jess Rowland. And litigation support. I mean, they're getting ready to fight off litigation. And they won't even call back Mr. Johnson and tell him, hey, maybe you should stop spraying. It goes worse. They talk about creating a genotox MOA plan. Could be important for future litigation support. So they're more concerned about litigation than they are about just calling a guy back and saying, hey, maybe you should be careful. So after this, now we're in September of 2015. I'm going to spend a few minutes and then I'll move on. There's these two documents and evidence. I want you to read them closely. So the first one is this email. And this is in response to a newspaper article about labeling Monsanto's Roundup carcinogenic. And it gets sent to Stephen Gould, who's the guy who actually deals with Mr. Johnson's distributor. And he's saying it's hard to understand how against all science and law can do this, Steve. And in response, the distributor says to him, this is in reference to people using this in California. We are being overrun by liberals and morons, sort of like a zombie movie. So we just have to start taking them out one at a time, starting with the elections next year. This is 2015. The elections next year are the next presidential elections. How does Monsanto's employee respond to this? I like this analogy. And he sends it on to other Monsanto employees. Liberals and morons. At the same time, they actually conduct a cost analysis of IARC's classification. They talk about there's going to be a gradual reduction in use. School districts are another big risk with the Healthy Schools Act and increased attention. They frequently use Promax and Pro-Concentrate today. And he even says, customers that I am aware that have already stopped using glyphosate since the IARC ruling, Irvine Unified School District, and several Bay Area cities and school districts. Yeah, that's right. Schools in San Francisco don't use Roundup. It's right there in black and white. But you know what they didn't do? Call up a man who was spraying at a school district in the Bay Area and say, hey, there's an IARC ruling. Because at this time in September 2015, he's still spraying. Because they never called him back. And in 2015, it transforms. It goes from being a scary, although controllable type of cancer to the indolent form. It became a death sentence. Finally, in January of 2016, Mr. Johnson succeeds in stopping the spraying. And as we know, the story goes on, the cancer gets worse. This is August 2016. You can see the lesions and the plaques are getting worse, concentrated. It's December 2016. They're getting higher and thicker, and you can start seeing it plaquing all over his skin. You can see these chunks of skin basically falling off of his body. This is January 2017. You can see it's literally everywhere, all over his body. June 2017. This is one of those ruptures that you talk about where it's exposed skin and it's painful. This is literally on his eyelids, so this is every time he blinks, he's in pain. Every time. All over his back, his feet, his legs. This is November 2017. This is getting worse and worse. And this is January 2018. Monsanto called a doctor who took this stand and said to you that Mr. Johnson was in complete remission. What the heck is he talking about? I mean, there's offensive and then there's completely bonkers. Mr. Johnson is not in complete remission. He's starting chemo in a few weeks. And everybody agrees, and I'm sorry, but everyone agrees that if he makes it to 2020, he won't make it to 2020 absent a miracle. That's the facts. That Monsanto would call someone up here and speculate about bone marrow transplants that no one has ever offered to him. That he might live till he's 30. When his most recent scan showed the exact opposite is outrageous. It is disgusting. It is reprehensible. That man has no dignity. I'm thankful I wasn't here for that direct. I was writing a brief in the back room for most of it. When I was reading the transcripts, I turned red. I go to sleep every night thinking about this man and his family. Because I know the consequences of what's happening to him. It haunts me. And he cavalierly says, complete remission. We had testimony from Dr. Naban. I'll be quick about this. He conducted a differential diagnosis. He looked at all the potential risk factors. All of them didn't apply. The only one that made sense was Roundup, supported by the animal data, supported by the epidemiology. And so the question is, is there evidence, more likely than not, that Roundup substantially contributed to his cancer? Absolutely. There is no real, this is overwhelming evidence. As part of this process, you're going to have to figure out damages. Now, the economic damages, that's the stuff we can calculate, and we've actually stipulated to it. And this is this number right here. It will be in your jury verdict form, so you don't have to remember it. You just have to add that to whatever you do. The hard part is the non-economic damages. And this is sort of an awkward thing to deal with, right? Because you're trying to pay someone money for physical pain, mental suffering, the loss of enjoyment in life, disfigurement, physical impairment, grief, anxiety, humiliation, emotional distress. It's so weird to talk about this in the context of money because it's such a personal thing. But we heard testimony from Mr. Johnson and his wife. I don't know, it moved me. It really did. That he's like, you know, he's at night crying to himself so his children don't see that he's afraid. That he's afraid to get into a pool because he's afraid people will see his cancer and not want to get in the pool after him. That he can't wear clothes that rub his skin because the lesions are so painful. That he can't sleep at night. That he gets chemotherapy time after time after time again. It's so bad that he can't even leave his bedroom for days at a time. And while this is happening, while he's fighting this fight, his wife is working 14 hours a day, 2 jobs to just pay the bills. What is that worth? I mean, how do you put a price tag on? I wish that upon nobody. My worst enemy, I would not wish that upon them. So it's a hard thing to do, and Mr. Dickens talked about that a lot in jury selection, and we threw around that. And I think the cleanest way is to think about his life expectancy, right? What we know is that he's had 4 years of this since 2014. He was diagnosed. And he will live between 2 more to 33 years. The number is simple, $1 million per year. For all that suffering, all that pain, it's $1 million per year. And if he lives for only 2 years, then the remaining years that he doesn't get to live is also $1 million. So it doesn't matter if he dies in 2 years or dies in 20, it's because he deserves that money. And so the non-economic damages are $37 million. That's the kind of money that fixes his situation to the best we can. That he can spend the last few years of his life, and pray to God it's more. Maybe he'll be able to afford some experimental treatments. But he'll be able to spend it with his wife. She sure is not going to have to work 14 hours a day. His children will be taken care of in the sense that he will now have the personal pride of knowing that he's taking care of his family. And his last years of life can be spent where it's deserved. An essential luxury. Instead of, never seeing his family and crying alone at night. But will he stop? Probably not. I mean, will the fear abate because he knows he's dying? Of course not. But this is the best we can do. And so when you combine both together, the economic damages plus the non-economic damages, it's this number, $39,253,209.23. I wish we didn't have to do this. I'd rather not be here actually at all. I'd rather he be taking his kids to a football game today. But he won't be able to today or tomorrow, the day after, because he can't be in the sun. Hurts his skin condition. And in a few weeks when he starts chemo, he'll be laid out again. Hopefully this time the chemo doesn't actually kill him. Came close pretty last time. So that's the compensatory damages. But separate and apart from compensatory damages is the third issue here. And that is, did Monsanto act with knowing disregard of human health? In the jury instructions, the court has defined malice. And malice is sort of an old-timey word, right? It sounds like what somebody has in their mind before they actively shoot somebody or stab them or something. But that's actually not what malice is here. It's anybody who, with willful and knowing disregard to the rights or safety of another. A person acts with knowing disregard when he or she is aware of the probable dangerous consequences of his or her conduct, and deliberately fails to avoid these consequences. So if you know there's a risk, if you know there's an issue, and you decide not to act, knowing that by not acting people will get hurt, that's malice. And that fits what Monsanto has done here to the T. Now the standard by which you have to do this is slightly different, right? Before it's that featherweight scale at 51%. That's for the compensatory stuff. But for punitive, it's bigger. Certain facts must be proved by clear and convincing evidence, which is a higher burden of proof. But what that means is the party must persuade you that it is highly probable that the fact is true. Highly probable that the fact is true. So is it highly probable that Monsanto, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, was so concerned about making money, specifically about making money in school districts, that it didn't call Mr. Johnson back? That's not rocket science. It's pretty obvious. We have a host of information, just literally a host of evidence in there. And actually, you're going to get 2 big binders that go back into evidence with you. And that's the evidence that you can look at. And it's replete with emails and damning documents. I think the only document that helps Monsanto in the entire piece of evidence is this EPA document, which you can't even consider for the truth of the matter. It can only be used to reflect a state of mind of Monsanto starting in September 2016, long after Mr. Johnson was given his death sentence. So look at the evidence. And I could go through it, and I'll probably go through some of it in rebuttal just to see what needs to be responded to. But here's what we know. Dr. Perry in 2000 issued 2 different reports saying this stuff is genotoxic and you need to study the formulated product in real people. Monsanto redid one of those studies and never did a single one after that. So they failed to test, and they did that deliberately. You have an email from Dr. Heidens where he says, we are not going to do the studies Perry suggests. More importantly, neither of those reports were ever given to anybody. They were buried. They were not given to the EPA, and they should have been. That is deliberate mischief. That is somebody who's trying to hide something. At the same time that Dr. Perry's report comes out, they ghostwrite and publish the Williams article in 2000. So to compound the failure to disclose to the EPA and everyone else, they then make up science that says the opposite. There couldn't be more clear evidence of intent that you could ask for. Now, I couldn't find an actual employee to go up there. Well, we did find an employee, but he was a former one, Dr. Acevedo. But we couldn't find an actual current employee of Monsanto to say, yes, I intended to hurt people. Okay, that's not the defense. The defense is, what does the document say? We know that they actively secured freedom to operate, which is a deliberate company-wide program to avoid regulation. They attacked IARC, not just kind of. They orchestrated outcry, and they did that before they even knew the results. That's deliberate disregard for human health. They refused to test. You heard back in 1985, there was a scientific advisory panel that said, hey, these kidneys that we're seeing in the mice, redo that study. Let's see if we see the kidney tumors again. Monsanto's response? Hell no. Because they didn't want to turn over any stones. That is deliberate disregard. And if they had, and it had shown tumors, then it would have been classified as a Class C carcinogen by the very EPA that they rely upon. But by stonewalling them in the 80s, they were able to hide that risk. And to this day, that test has never been done. Never. And sure, other people have done tests, sure. But they all continue to show tumor after tumor after tumor. And Monsanto has done absolutely nothing to address that beyond simply ghostwriting literature criticizing it. And that's literally their job. We heard about the Grime article that everyone relied upon, where that mysterious virus in the Kumar study appeared. It was written by Monsanto. We also have them targeting schools. They literally were targeting selling to school districts in California to make money at the time of after the IARC classification. I don't know how gross of an organization can be to do that. If you have any suspicion that your product can cause cancer, you don't try to increase sales at schools. That is reprehensible conduct. And that's what they were doing. The MSDS, the Material Safety Data Sheet, currently warns, but the label that goes to consumers does not. There is absolutely no excuse for that. They cannot excuse it. That's conscious disregard. And they never called Mr. Johnson back. I don't know what kind of person knows about risks, has a guy call you twice saying, hey, is this stuff causing my cancer? You refuse to call him, and then it transforms into the aggressive type. That is not just conscious disregard, that is conscious disregard for this man in this room today. It is unacceptable. So how do we calculate punitive damages? It's a tough conversation. It's not about Mr. Johnson, right? It's not about how we pay him or recover. That's the compensatory part. The question is, how do we punish the company? And it says, in view of Monsanto's financial condition, what amount is necessary to punish it and discourage future wrongful conduct? Right now, Miss Buck, she's sitting over there in that corner. On her cell phone is a speed dial to a conference room in St. Louis, Missouri. And in that conference room, in that boardroom, there's a bunch of executives waiting for the phone to ring. Behind them is a bunch of champagne on ice.
Your Honor,
They want to see.
it's supposed to be about the evidence. This is complete fantasy.
Sustained.
The number that you have to come out with is a number that tells those people, they hear it, and they have to put the phone down, look at each other and say, we have to change what we're doing. Because if the number comes out and it's not significant enough, champagne corks are popping. Attaboys are everywhere.
Your Honor,
And they're laughing at you.
Objection.
Sustained. Mr. Wisner, please do not engage in speculation. You may continue.
Their net worth is $6.6 billion. They have in cash on hand $3.1 billion. The annual interest on just the cash on hand, that means the amount of money they make for doing nothing. And at a 2% interest rate, which that kind of money you could probably get better results. But at a 2% interest rate, $62 million a year for doing nothing. And I have been racking my brain about what is a proper punishment for Monsanto. What is a number that will make them deter future wrongful conduct? And I came up with it. Mr. Johnson was exposed in 2014. And by all estimates, it looks like he will probably lose his cancer by 2020. So that's 6 years. 6 years of their failure to warn and its effects on Mr. Johnson. I want every dollar they made on interest for those 6 years. 6 times 62 is $373 million. That's a number that makes people change their way. That's a number that sends a signal to Monsanto and everybody that works there. We will not tolerate this kind of conduct. It's the kind of number that makes sure that next time somebody calls Monsanto and says, hey, should I keep spraying this stuff? They call him back. It's the kind of number that makes that label change tomorrow. This is what we request in punitive damages. Now, of course, you can go higher. You can go lower. Same thing with compensatory, by the way. You can go higher or lower. That's entirely up to you. But this is a number I'd like you to stay around. Because this is a number that I think is appropriate for this case and this conduct. Let's talk about the verdict form. Go to the Elmo. Thanks, Brian. So you're going to be presented with a verdict form, and this is what it looks like. And you're going to be asked to sort of answer a bunch of questions. And what I'd like you to do is to answer yes to every question except number 6, answer no. That's the shorthand. I'm actually going to walk you through the questions now, but that's what I'd like you to do. The first question is, are Roundup Pro or Ranger Pro products ones about which an ordinary consumer can form reasonable minimum safety expectations? Simply put, in using Roundup as it's sold on the market today, would you think that it causes cancer? Particularly when the label specifically says it doesn't have any risk of that. So the answer is obviously yes, right? You can look at a Roundup product and say, oh, yeah, I have a minimum expectation of safety. Did Roundup fail to perform as safely as an ordinary consumer would have expected when used or misused in an intended or reasonably foreseeable way? So if you follow the label, would you expect to get cancer? The label is in evidence. Take a look at it. There's nothing about cancer. All it says is that it's non-toxic to animals. That's what it says. And it might be an eye irritant. So if you follow the directions, there's no reason to believe that it causes cancer. Was the Roundup Pro or Ranger Pro design a substantial factor in causing harm to Mr. Johnson? So, did the fact that it had glyphosate and it had the surfactants and all the stuff and impurities that go into it? We heard testimony about formaldehyde, ethyl dioxide. There's like a bunch of really bad known carcinogens in the mixture. Did any of that design contribute to his injury? And absolutely it did, right? Because without the surfactant, the one that they used, it wouldn't have been able to penetrate his suit, his skin, and get to him. So it's the design itself that's a problem. And we know, because we heard testimony about it, there's other types of surfactants they could use that are not as problematic. We saw a slideshow from Monsanto's own employees saying the stuff's toxic, POEA. There's no reason why they have to use POEA in this country. There's no reason for it. Now we're on to the next case. That was, by the way, the design defect claim, okay? Now we're on to the next claim, strict liability, failure to warn. Did Roundup have potential risks that were known or knowable in light of the scientific knowledge that was generally accepted in the scientific community at the time of their manufacture, distribution, or sale? So did Monsanto know, or should they have known, that they could cause cancer? They have studies that start in the 1990s onward. There is absolutely no question. And you look at the documents, they constantly raise alarm. This adds fuel to the fire about Hardell. How do we combat this? That's from Erickson in 2008. The evidence is overwhelming that they knew about the risk. So they knew about it. It's not even knowable. They knew about it. Based on the published literature at the time, did the potential risks of Roundup Pro or Ranger Pro present a substantial danger to persons using or misusing the products? Yes, they did, right? Obviously, anybody who uses it, there's a potential risk of cancer. They didn't warn about it. That's clearly a potential risk. This is the no. Would ordinary consumers have recognized the potential risk? Of course not, right? It's not on the label. How do you know Roundup causes cancer? Mr. Johnson was actually told, he was told by the Horizon distributor that it's safe enough to drink. So clearly there was no warning about it causing cancer. So the answer to this one is no. Did Monsanto fail to adequately warn? Yes, because they didn't say it could cause cancer. Was the lack of a sufficient warning a substantial factor in causing Mr. Johnson's harm? Of course it was. He testified unequivocally he would never have used it if he could known it could cause cancer. And as soon as he found out that he had cancer, he was suspicious about it, he did everything in his power to stop using it. So clearly if they had warned, he wouldn't have used it. And it probably wouldn't have gotten worse. So that's the first claim. That's the strict liability, failure to warn. Now we're on to claim of negligent failure to warn. Did Monsanto know, or should it reasonably have known, that Roundup Pro or Ranger Pro were dangerous or are likely to be dangerous when used or misused in a reasonably foreseeable manner? It's the same issue. Did they know or could they have known it caused cancer? Answer is yes. Did Monsanto know, or should it reasonably have known, that users would not realize the danger? Well, if it doesn't say it on the label, how could they have known? The only people who knew that it could cause cancer were people who were studying the literature, and a reasonable consumer is not somebody who would be doing that. So the answer here is yes. Did Monsanto fail to adequately warn of the danger or instruct on the safe use of Roundup Ranger Pro? Yes. Would a reasonable manufacturer, distributor, or seller under the same or similar circumstances have warned of the danger or instructed on the safe use? Obviously, right? It's not just what a reason, this is the law. If you have something that causes cancer, you warn. And you have to warn. And so would they have done it? Absolutely. Monsanto, of course, didn't care. They wanted to make money, so they didn't. And then was it a substantial contributing factor in causing harm? Yes, we've discussed this. Then below that is the claim of damages. We've talked about what are Mr. Johnson's damages. And this one you can write in, past non-economic damages. We estimated that at $4 million. Future non-economic damages, that was $33 million based on his potential life expectancy or the years he won't live. Then we get to punitive damages. Do you find by clear and convincing evidence that Monsanto acted with malice, as we defined earlier, or oppression in the conduct which you base your finding of liability for Mr. Johnson? So if you think they acted with reckless disregard for human health in failing to warn Mr. Johnson, then the answer is yes. And if you think it's highly probable that that's what was going on, then you answer yes to this question. And then was the conduct constituting malice, oppression, committed, ratified, or authorized by one or more officers, directors, or managing agents of Monsanto acting on behalf of Monsanto? We've already discussed Dr. Heidens and Dr. Farmer. Dr. Goldstein, the guy who didn't call Mr. Johnson back, he's actually the lead toxicologist for Monsanto. I think he testified that he's been personally responsible for human toxicological needs for over 19 years. So the answer here is yes. And then obviously, you put in the punitive damages amount here, and then the presiding juror will sign it and date it. Now, one of the things that you're going to have to do when you go back in the juror room, and we're going to be wrapping up in a second for lunch, is you're going to have to pick a presiding juror. And that's really important. That if you want to be a presiding juror, speak up. Say, hey, I want to be the foreman. That's what they typically call it. But we call it a presiding juror in California. And your role really is just to help facilitate the conversation. And a lot of you are going to have questions. And what's great about a jury is you get to ask each other questions. And hopefully you guys can help answer them. And if there's evidence you need to see, testimony you want to read here, ask us for it. All right? That's our job. And your job is to base your decisions on the record. I think the record here is pretty overwhelming. Monsanto didn't really put up much of a defense. Their defense really, for what it's worth, consists of EPA, EPA, EPA. We all know that that's not enough because the EPA gets things wrong. And we know it got it wrong here. So in a minute, Mr. Lombardi, or after lunch, Mr. Lombardi is going to come up here and he's going to plaster up parts of the EPA. And that's what he's going to do. That's what he did in his opening. That's what he's going to do here. But where is the Monsanto employees? I mean, think about this for a second. They're being sued. I think with a valid case here. And they didn't bring a single human being from the company to look into your eyes and say why they did what they did. They didn't bring a single live human being here to talk to you. Talk straight and say, here, this is what we thought. This is why we did it. Why? Why didn't they bring anybody? There's two possibilities. One, they couldn't find someone who could do that and not commit perjury. Or two, they were afraid of all the documents I would have to run through them, showing that there's no conceivable way they didn't know the risk. You have to look at the quality of the evidence presented. Look at the quality of the experts we presented. Literally the leaders in their field. I mean, literally nobody knows glyphosate better than Dr. Portier. I don't think anyone would even dispute that. He's been studying it on his own, going out and talking to regulators on his own dime because he cares. He did this for a living for the federal government, and he's outraged that the EPA is violating their own guidelines. Why does Monsanto get special treatment from the EPA? I don't know. Maybe it's just Rowland. Maybe there's something more sinister. I don't know. But what I do know is they got it wrong. And today in this courtroom, tomorrow in deliberations, and when you return a verdict, we're going to make it right. And your verdict will be heard around the world. And Monsanto will have to finally do something. Conduct those studies they never conducted, and warn those people they never warned. Thank you for your time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break now for the lunch recess. Please remember during the lunch recess, do not discuss the case with anyone, do not do any research. We ran to 12:15 today, so we'll resume again at 1:45. Okay, 1:45. All right, thank you.
What we just saw was a fantastic use of the ellipse. You know, the ... and using quotes from things. Almost every one of the quotes used by Mr. Lombardi had an ellipsis, and the ... tells the whole story. So I'm just going to go through a couple of factual things just right off the bat, all right? Just before we ended, he said Dr. Sawyer said that the risk was, what did he say? He said it was 7 to 8 years or something like that. This is actually what he testified to. My notes are on here, so I'm just going to fold it so you don't see them. It says, this is at line 377, 9 through 12. I put in my report, and I quoted the same thing to you that I told the jury, that the latency period following environmental exposures is relatively unknown and has been estimated between 1 and 25 years. So this minimum latency of 6-7 years, and they're trying to put it in Dr. Sawyer's mouth, is garbage. It's just not true. It's a misstatement of what he testified to and the evidence that you've seen. Another ellipse that was pretty bad. They talked about Dr. Naban, and this one was probably one of the worst ones. So before I show it to you, the theory is that Mr. Johnson's treating doctors, right, all told him it was not Roundup that caused his cancer. Ironically, they didn't call any of those treating doctors to the stand, even though they're just down the street. And the reason why they didn't is because the evidence actually shows that they didn't know if it caused cancer because they never researched the issue. And so they go, well, even Dr. Naban said that they said it wouldn't cause it, and they gave a quote, and then there was a ... I'm going to read right after the ... So here's what he showed you. He said, all right, and as you went through the records and you went through the depositions, you noted that each of them came to the conclusion that they didn't know what caused mycosis fungoides. Is that right? They were not aware of what may have contributed to it. And then there was a ... That's what he showed you. That's what Mr. Lombardi chose to say to you. But what's after the dot? Again, none of them really reviewed the epidemiological literature. As I told you before, even before I reviewed the literature myself in the spring of 2016, I was not aware of the association. But after reviewing the literature, I became aware. So I don't know if they actually had a chance to review all the literature that we went through today. Okay, and he got cut off by Mr. Lombardi. That's the dot. That's the story that's not being told to you. You did hear from one treating doctor, Dr. Ofodole, and she did say that she was concerned, so concerned that she wrote a letter. Now, Mr. Lombardi said, well, Dr. Hoppy, he wrote a letter too. But we also heard why. It was because Mr. Johnson had been out of work, and he had to pay his bills because of his cancer, and Mr. Johnson asked him to write the letter so he could get back to work. There was no assessment by Dr. Hoppy, Dr. Kim, Dr. Tai that the evidence doesn't support a causal association. And I couldn't believe this. They had he had a picture. I actually don't have all of his slides. He used a lot of things that I haven't seen, but he had a picture where Dr. Naban is by himself, and all of these doctors are on the other side. Now, none of those doctors actually gave that opinion, so that's all misleading. And then they snuck in Dr. Kuzel. You notice that? First of all, Dr. Kuzel did not treat Mr. Johnson. He actually never even met him. His entire understanding of Mr. Johnson was based on reading a deposition. Now, what's so weird about that argument is that Dr. Kuzel admitted on the stand that he looked at one study related to Roundup. One study. A study given to him by Mr. Lombardi, and it was the AHS from 2018. That was it. My co-counsel asked him repeatedly, did you look at any of the other epidemiological literature? Other epidemiological literature that specifically looked at the subtypes of NHL? Nope. Nope. There is no cause of mycosis fungoides. But you know what else he said? He says when he has a lung cancer patient in his office, and they go, I've been smoking my whole life. Could it be the smoking? He'd say, I don't think so. We don't know that. That's what he said. They hired a guy and put on the stand somebody who doesn't believe in causation. Okay. It's easy to not find associations when you don't look. So that's what happened there. The actual evidence in front of you, the only person who examined Mr. Johnson, who looked at the literature, looked at his exposures, and did a differential diagnosis was Dr. Naban. And I think he was being attacked because he got promoted to a really fancy job at a fancy company, and that somehow makes him no longer able. Well, he said right here he didn't even know about this issue until he looked into it. And that's the point. That's the problem here. It's not on the label. It's not a doctor wants to find, oh, is this associated with cancer? They look at the label. They look at the data, and it's not there. Doctors do the same thing with prescriptions. They look at the label. And so every one of these doctors probably looked at the label. Well, I don't see anything about cancer. Must not cause cancer. That's hardly a scientific analysis. And the fact that Mr. Lombardi relies upon what somebody said to somebody else to somebody, didn't even call a single person live to talk about it, and then says none of them say it causes cancer, is just profoundly misleading. Don't forget the ellipsis. Another thing that was pretty amazing, and he based a large part of his defense on this idea, was that to prove a duty to warn, we have to show that the scientific consensus in the world was that it caused cancer. That is complete nonsense. That is not the law. I'm going to show you the law in 1 second. That is not. If that was the law, you could never sue for a drug that had been approved by the FDA. You could never sue for a pesticide that had been approved by the EPA. We all know that's not true because the law doesn't say that. Here's the law. That Roundup or Ranger Pro had a potential risks that were known or knowable in light of the scientific and medical knowledge that was generally accepted. So it's not saying that it had to be generally accepted that in fact it caused cancer or that there was a risk, but merely that the science that was generally available and accepted could lead to knowing of the risk. And that's the epidemiological studies. Erickson, DeRoos 2005, DeRoos 2003, Hardell. The epi is pretty rampant, but more than the epi, there's actual real data. And he kept calling them cell studies, the mechanistic studies. That's just misleading in the extreme. He didn't even mention the numerous studies done on people living in Ecuador, living in Colombia, who in real-world exposures were getting sprayed with Roundup to combat cocoa plants. And what did they do? They went and tested their blood. Real people in the real world, human data. And it showed genetic damage. And people who weren't sprayed, no genetic damage. And the data showed, and Dr. Portier discussed this. They didn't bring an expert to discuss this at all. Dr. Portier said, yeah, it showed that the genetic damage lasted for a few weeks. And then after there was no spraying, it was gone. And that's exactly what you would expect here. Repeated insults causing repeated genetic damage. Mr. Johnson, over a course of 3 months, is spraying almost every other day for 3 hours, 150 gallons a clip. His body didn't have the chance to rebuild or repair the genetic damage. And that's how he got cancer. This idea of latency came up, and he says the 9/11 Commission said this was for ionizing radiation. It's completely incorrect. Yes, they used ionizing radiation studies to come up with latency, but there was no radiation exposure at 9/11. There was no nuclear bomb that went off. There was chemicals in the air that people breathed in, that were exposed to. And if they got cancer, specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, within 4 months, they were compensated. That was the 9/11 Commission. That is the definitive minimum latency requirement of 4 months. Now, there was this discussion about when did he actually have a sprayer break or whatever? And he says, Mr. Wisner is trying to make it seem like the exposure happened before the rash, but it's just not supported. And what I couldn't believe, he actually showed you Exhibit 332. This is that email that was regarding what he had said to them, right? And he says right here that this resulted in him becoming soaked to the skin on his face, neck, and head with Ranger Pro. He said he was wearing a white exposure suit and it even went inside that. A few months after this incident, he noticed a rash on his knee, then on his face, and later on the side of his head. So based on the very document that they say it happened in February of 2014, he's specifically saying it happened before any rash. That's their document. That is their record. This is what they told him after 45 minutes of careful probing by this person about specific information. A level of detail, of exposure that nobody else did with Mr. Johnson. Because the conversation in the doctor room was, it was Dr. Ofodele. The first instance of this happening in 2013 was Dr. Ofodele. It was late in the afternoon. It was 4:15. Remember she talked about this? They were rushing it, and she just wrote down your exposure. And then when I asked her, is that actually really accurate? She goes, that's probably wrong. If he had it back in 2013, we would have known. He would have said something. And he went to a doctor. If there's supposed to be a rash on his face in 2013, how would a medical record at that time say negative for rash? It's incomprehensible. And on top of that, the only records they show are just repeating of the misstatements of the year prior. They're all like a year and a half later. That's not a helpful record. But it doesn't matter. I said this before. Bless you. It doesn't matter if it happened in the fall of 2013 because there's still time for the tumor to have developed on his face and in his body. The latency period is sufficient. And that's the record before you. I was challenged about the Perry study. He said, he can't show you what they were thinking. Yes, we can. And I only have a certain amount of time in this courtroom to go over the evidence with you. They're binders of it. And I've shown you document after document after document. In openings, it's been on videos. And I cannot sit here and systematically go through all the documents showing Monsanto's misconduct for the last 20, 30 years. I can't. I've tried to show you portions of it. I've tried to put it together. But absent me just going off for a few days, which I could do, I'll spare you. But let me take up that challenge, right? He said that Dr. Perry recommended a bunch of studies and that they did it. Well, you heard testimony about this, specifically from Dr. Portier, who reviewed what they did and what Dr. Perry recommended. And he specifically said, it's fine, he specifically said they did one of them because his recommendations were pretty robust. He talked about studying actions recommended. He talked about providing comprehensive cytogenic data from glyphosate formulations. They never did that. That's not what they did. What they redid is they redid one of the studies back from 1997. That's it. And what they did is they confirmed the results. That's actually what Heiden's did. But they didn't do all the other ones. And there's a whole bunch here. It goes on. And this is Exhibit 220. So you can look at it. And those of you with a good scientific background will actually understand this in pretty detail. He's raising serious concerns. He's saying this stuff's genotoxic. This stuff needs to be studied. You got to look at the formulation. You got to look for the synergies. This is the contemporaneous response. This is what they said. This is Exhibit 269. Hold on. Let me show you the other one. This is Exhibit 270. And this is an email exchange. And what does he say? This is them talking about Stephen Ratton is talking about the thing, and he goes, has he ever worked with industry before on this sort of project? Right? And then at the end of it, he comments, I don't want to spend too much time finding this. He makes a comment, I hope it didn't cost much. Oh, here it is. He goes right here. I see there's little value in the write-up as written that could be useful. Hope it didn't cost much. Perhaps it's too harsh, but I don't know what your proposal was with him. But I guess I would expect more from this of a professor. And then This is what Dr. Hedlund said. This is Exhibit 221, and this lays it all out in black and white. This is Monsanto's thinking, okay? Dr. Hedlund's, this is to a bunch of people, including Dr. Farmer. He's copying himself. I read the report and agree with the comments. There's various things that can be done to improve the report. However, let's step back and look at what we're really trying to achieve here. We want to develop someone who is comfortable with the genotox profile of glyphosate Roundup and who can be influential with regulators and scientific outreach operations when genotox issues arise. My read is that Perry is not currently such a person, and that it would take quite some time and money studies to get him there. We simply aren't going to do the studies Perry suggests. Mark, do you think Perry can become a strong advocate even without doing this work, Perry? If not, we should seriously start looking for one or more other individuals to work with. Even if we think we can eventually bring Perry around closer to where we need him, we should currently be looking for a second backup genotox supporter. That's their thinking. We are not doing the studies that Perry suggests. Why? Because we don't want to see what they show us. Remarkably, in 270, we also have this great email from Dr. Farmer. This is about the Perry write-up. And she says, I am concerned about leaving Perry out there with this as the final project, his final impressions. If you remember his first report, he was looking for work for a graduate student. I wonder if this evaluation was his or someone else's. Dr. Farmer is worried about it being out there. And what happened to it? It never got sent to his living soul. It got buried. All right. Go to this thing. I was challenged to show you an epidemiological study that was statistically significant that controlled for confounding. Well, that's DeRoos 2003. And if you recall, Dr. Mucci and I had a little back and forth about this. And she was like, oh, I'm not sure if the logistical regression controlled for it or not. And I said, if I can prove it to you definitively, will you change your mind? She said, I'll think about it. And then I proved it to her, and she went, well, I don't want to change my mind. Right? But the simple fact is that this is Exhibit 710. This was shown to you repeatedly. And in here, we have specifically the results for glyphosate. And if you see right here, oh, sorry, this is the wrong table. Oh, perfect. So I pushed the wrong thing anyway. All right, so this is Table 3, and it has all the pesticides that they're studying, where they concluded, by the way, that there was absolutely no confounding observed. And for glyphosate, they have a risk ratio of 2.1. That's statistically significant. And this is adjusting, as it says right here. Each estimate is adjusted for the use of all other pesticides listed in Table 3. Doubling of the risk, statistically significant, fully adjusted. It's right there in black and white. And he showed you the meta-analysis done by Dr. Mucci. Which one did she pick to show you? The 1.6, this hierarchical regression that nobody thinks is valid. It's just not. The right answer is 2.1, and it's statistically significant, fully adjusted. It's right there, ladies and gentlemen. One of the things that was raised was this idea that Dr. Portier is an outlier, that he's out there making hay, and he stands by himself, that all the European regulators and all the scientists think he's crazy. The problem is, it's just not true. So this is another document that you've seen, and this was shown quite a bit throughout various parts. And this was actually a letter that Dr. Portier published. And this is the letter that was joined onto by over 100 independent scientists from around the world. And every one of them agreed with the conclusion, which stated that the most likely, let me give you the exact conclusion. The most appropriate, here we go. The most appropriate and scientifically based evaluation of the cancers reported in humans and laboratory animals, as well as supportive mechanistic data, is that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. And on the basis of this conclusion, and the absence of evidence to the contrary, it is reasonable to conclude that glyphosate formulations should also be considered likely human carcinogens. He does not stand alone. You also saw testimony and evidence from the Scientific Advisory Panel, the panel that severely criticized the SAP report, severely criticized, said you didn't follow your guidelines, you ain't following the rules, you're coming to the wrong conclusions. That was also another group of independent scientists who also disagreed. The simple fact is the independent scientists in the world, and by the way, on this study right here is DeRoos, so one of the authors of the AHS. The simple fact is, I don't want to show you now, but it's been done before. The simple fact is the independent scientists agree with Dr. Portier. The only one who disagrees with Dr. Portier is Monsanto, EPA, and EFSA. The very people who have a very vested interest in the outcome of whether or not it causes cancer. Everybody else, basically across the board. Dr. Blair, Dr. Ross. I mean, Dr. Ross, they played a video of Dr. Ross, and he said the mechanistic data was so strong that even if the animal data was insufficient, and even if the human data was insufficient, the mechanistic data was so strong they were going to upgrade it for IARC. They haven't presented a single person to rebut any of that testimony. The only thing they got is EPA, EPA, EPA. And the irony of it is, they want you to believe that this goes to their state of mind. That, hey, we just believe the EPA, so we didn't do anything wrong. This came out in September 2016. The judge is instructing you, you can only use this for Monsanto's state of mind. That's it. That's the only allowance for this. By the time this report ever was published, by the time they ever saw it, Mr. Johnson was diagnosed and had stopped spraying it already. This is, as it's presented right now, almost irrelevant for the purposes of evidence in this case. But that said, this document, it specifically ends with a request, that they study the formulated product. It goes, as previously mentioned, some believe that glyphosate formulations may be more toxic than glyphosate alone. And it goes on, they're even less, and it talks about a program that it wants to develop with the National Toxicology Program. This is all on page 141 to 142. He said that the regulators don't require it, but they sure want it. And how could we be sitting here almost 50 years after the formulated product hit the market and Monsanto hasn't even bothered to look at it? How is that possible? Because the state of mind is simple. There is document after document showing that Monsanto knew the formulated product was problematic. Your Honor, can I get a time count?
You have 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. One of the documents that I think is particularly helpful on this is an email exchange where they're discussing the POEA surfactant. All right, I think this is Exhibit 282. No, it's not 282. All right, let's talk about one thing. Let's talk about 215 first. So this is, and there's literally, if you just sit down and actually read through this, these documents, you're going to be blown away. Thanks. That's what I thought. Okay. First, let's talk about this. This is actually a PowerPoint presentation that was done by Monsanto. Surfactant toxicology, okay? And the very last slide, this is their own scientists. Surfactants are biologically not inert. They can be toxic, and this must be addressed. This was from Dr. Martin's testimony, and this was back in 2003. We are 15 years later, and they still haven't studied the formulated product. Let's look at another one. Exhibit 283. Is it 283? Thank you. That's what I'm mixing. All right. 383. Sorry, making a mess. So this is Exhibit 383. And this is an email exchange, again, confidential. They're discussing, this is in 2010. And it literally has handwritten notes from Dr. Haydens that says the reasons for defending taloamines. That's POEAs, right? And in the question preceding this, it specifically says they're talking about doing another possible POEA, another type of surfactant, and they're saying, should we study it? What are the results going to be? And this guy poses a really good question. Anyway, there are non-hazardous formulations. So why sell a hazardous one? And if you turn the page, he gives the reasons for that. He says, first, there's still strong sentiment in St. Louis that we need to continue to defend taloamines, even though we prepare to switch over because of their impending demise. Reasons to do so? Domino effect on ethyramines. That's another type of surfactant. Defend other world areas to the best of our ability. Second, I was in Brazil all last week, and they're very worried about this coming across the Atlantic to their part of the American hemisphere. They know they're dangerous. They know they have a problem. They know they're hazardous, but they're still doing it because they're worried about a domino effect. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ranger Pro that's used to this day, the stuff that Mr. Johnson used, the stuff that you buy in a hardware store, it still contains POEA. That was 8 years ago. There's no excuse to being selling this anymore. There was this idea that they didn't know that there was a danger, that it wasn't known in the scientific community. Yes, the scientific community wasn't sure about it yet. We don't have to prove that. But they knew. It's replete, literally, everywhere in this testimony. I think the last thing I want to show you, and then I'll be ending off, was this idea that Dr. Naban wasn't sure that, there's this idea of this causation, and that maybe he wouldn't have gotten cancer, that he was on the fence, that he might have gotten cancer anyway. And he showed you another quote with an ellipsis. Here's the black and white, the full testimony. This is what's really important here. Is it more likely than not that Mr. Johnson will not make it past 2019 based on what you've seen? And he says no. And here's the question.
Your Honor, I object. This is not what I showed him. I'm misrepresenting the record. This is actually from somebody. This is from the direct examination, not from the cross.
This is the testimony of Dr. Naban.
All right, very well. So if it's the testimony of Dr. Naban.
Yeah, testimony Mr. Lombardi didn't show them. And to a reasonable degree of medical probability, is it true that but for Mr. Johnson's exposure to Roundup, he would not have developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? Absolutely. This idea that he would have gotten cancer no matter what, and that Dr. Naban said that, is a complete fabrication. That's the testimony. And that Mr. Lombardi would tell you otherwise is a disservice to the quality of man I like to think he is. I think he's a nice guy. But that was not true what he said to you. And my client deserves the truth. And if you have any questions as you're deliberating, ask. We'll find the document. We'll find whatever it is that you need to prove up whatever issue you're trying to figure out. Because at the end of the day, the evidence is actually overwhelming. And other than hiding behind the EPA, Monsanto has quite literally no defense. And they're hiding behind the EPA because we've seen in the record they had a relationship with the guy who wrote the EPA document. That's the truth of it. That's what we know. So do the right thing. Go back into that deliberation room, answer those questions, talk it out, figure out the truth. Because the truth is, it causes cancer. It caused Mr. Johnson's cancer. And these guys need to be held accountable. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a long day. Thank you very much, all of you, for paying such close attention and taking copious notes. We're going to adjourn for today. Please remember, do not discuss the case. Please do not do any research on the case, including internet research. Please return tomorrow morning at 9:30 to this courtroom. At that time, I will have a few final instructions for you, the ones I did not read today from the package. And after that, you'll go into the deliberation room to conduct your deliberations. So please remember, do not conduct any research, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. All right, thank you.
Including the alternates?
Yes, Evelyn, please.